Yes.
the three experiences. As you say, I started as a historian of England and had, by 1968, done quite a lot of work on English social history and been trained as a historian of England. And then I went with my first wife to Nepal, 1968, at the end of 1968, to do my conventional anthropological fieldwork. And I arrived, at that time, you tried to find a society which was small, enclosed, a community which you could study in a functional, total way, and as different from your own as possible. So you get a lot of shock, and you'd have to really expand your mind to encompass something which was in all respects different. So with guidance from my supervisor, the great anthropologist Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, I went to a remote village in Highland, Nepal, in just underneath the Annapurna Mountains in central Nepal. At that time, it was remote. There was no electricity, no road, no. In another sense, it wasn't as remote as one liked to make out, because quite a lot of the men had been abroad for army service in the British Gurkhas, and there were radios and things like that. But it felt remote, and it was still exhibiting many features of an older period when people believed in witches, and shamanism was prevalent, and people gathered in the evenings to dance and sing and so on. So it was sufficiently other and distant. And it was, for me anyway, a huge shock. Everything I'd taken for granted, more or less, my family system, the ideas of privacy, of decency, of monotheism, all sorts of things were suddenly, there was an alternative which worked perfectly well. And I liked the people and admired them. And they seemed to get on perfectly well without being Christians or washing every day or having locks on their doors or whatever it was. And so I was challenged, and as anthropologists have to do, at first it's all chaos. It's like a child being born, nothing makes sense. And you don't understand a word of the language or the culture. And then gradually, through guessing and then testing and demonstrating, and then it fitting, and gradually the culture, you begin to see it. It takes 6 months or 9 months or a year. And by the end, I could see something of it anyway, and vowed to come back, though I didn't go back for another 16 years. And when I went back, because I had a new family and so on and so on, I went back with Sarah in 1986, and she loved it. And I was amazed to find they remembered me and so on. And then it became a parallel world for me, because we went back almost every year for the next 20 years or 18 years. I've been there 20 times in the last 50 years. So for 15 years or so, I was half in Cambridge and half in the Himalayas, in a sort of productive tension between a shamanic enchanted world where every rock, every tree, every house is filled with spirits. The fireplace has a spirit in, the water tap has a spirit in. It's a pre-axial age, very ancient shamanic world, which a number of anthropologists had documented, and I was experiencing. And to then come back to King's College, Cambridge, and teach my students and so on was very odd, but a productive tension, I think. So that was the first questioning of my assumption of how the world was ordered, and that my world was somehow superior and got it all right. But it doesn't really change things over here, because it's like a dream. You're the butterfly that has woken up to be a human being, or the other way around. And this is real while you're in it, and that's over there in a dream, and then vice versa. So it wasn't until I went to Japan in 1990, at the invitation of the British Council as a visiting scholar. And there again, I went partly because I already had a sense that there was something similar about Japan. Mark Bloch, in his great book on feudal society, singles out Japan as the only example he knows of a kind of feudalism that you find in England called centralized feudalism. The only other example he knew of in the world was in Japan. And Japan was also famous for being, like England, the first industrial society in its area. And again, 2 generations before anywhere else. And it was an island. And so I was curious about Japan, though I knew nothing about it. So Sarah and I went for a wonderful 6 weeks, and we met, and this transformed. Anthropology, it's not always acknowledged. Anthropology is basically about friendship. How can you get inside the minds and hearts of another civilization if you're not born and brought up in it, and if you don't speak the language? The only way really is through friendship. That's to say, you become very close to 1 or 2 people. You build up a liking, a trust, a set of communication devices, so you can talk about things in shorthand and refer back to a history of mutual understanding. And then you explore each other's worlds in conversations and experiences over time. That's how children learn, through building up these relationships. And that's how the best anthropology is done. If you look at the work of Evans Pritchard or Fiora Heimendorf or others, they say, you know, my main source of information was X or Y or whatever. Well, when we went to Japan, we met 2 scholars, Toshiko Nakamura, professor, who had invited me, or at least suggested I came because she'd read my book on marriage and love in England, and she was an early feminist and very interested in that book. And she suggested to her husband, who was a professor of international relations, Kenichi Nakamura, later dean of Hokkaido University, to invite me. So we went, and they took us under their wing, and they were like parents to us. At first, we were just infants or babies. They explained, this is what you do, Alan, this is what you don't do. They took us to their homes, and we had sort of intensive discussions and seminars. And that would have been wonderful for 6 weeks. But it then happened again in 1993, 1995, 1997, 1999, 2003, 2005, 2007, 2009. And also they came over they were visiting fellows, and they knew quite a bit about England, luckily. They'd been visiting fellows at Oxford at Nissan Institute. And then they later started coming to Cambridge at Clare Hall. So we continued a conversation over a period of 15 years where Kenichi would say, I do not understand your religion. Why are you so religious, Alan? And I'd say, I'm not religious, I'm agnostic. And he said, no, you're totally religious. Don't you realize everything you do, your philosophy, the way you explain things, your art, your aesthetics, your poetry, your garden, it's all religious. And I suddenly realized it was, you know, that Christianity is everywhere. And then I would say to him, you know, why is it that children who went into a school class on our first visit, and I said, can I ask some questions? And the teacher said, yes, of course. And so I said, you know, what are you going to hope to do when you grow up? And they all wanted to be engineers and so on. And then I said, could you ask them what their religion is? And the teacher looked at me and said, or to my friend, and said, I can't ask them that. And I thought this was some sort of taboo subject. I said, why not? And they said, well, there's no word. They don't know what religion means. There's no word in Japanese for religion, as there isn't in Chinese. What can I ask them? So I said, well, because I'd just come past a whole lot of Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples and things on the way to the school, and they were all banging and gongs and things. So I said, well, okay, well, how many of them have heard of the Buddha? Because there was a Buddhist temple just outside. None of them had heard of the Buddha. I said, how many of you have heard of Lao Tse and Buddha and Taoism? No. Jesus? No. Muhammad? No. Had no idea. It wasn't taught. They knew nothing. So it was a religious blank. So I said to Kenichi and Toshiko, you know, how do you explain this? And basically, those 15 years were them trying to understand the English, our sense of humor, our sense of identity, why we had war graves, while there are no war graves in China, things like this. And me trying to understand these famous paradoxes of Japan, and both ands that Ruth Benedict describes in The Chrysanthemum and the Sword.